So I'm super excited to kick off this live training session on Agile workspace structures in Wrike and introduce you to two genuinely amazing individuals from our team. First, we have Alex Homa, our Customer Success Strategic Program Lead. Alex will help answering your questions today. Next, we have Brett Bellon, our Professional Services Engagement Manager, who will be your instructor today. I'll let him do the proper introduction in a moment. And my name is Marina Novoselova. I'm Senior Customer and Tech Training Instructor. As I mentioned, we had part one session 2 days ago, and we talked about where to find the Wrike knowledge base, touched on Agile fundamentals, configured a workspace structure, and learned about cross-tagging and handling backlogs. In case you didn't attend the first part, we're recording all of the sessions and the recordings will be sent to you in the follow-up email. They are also going to be available in Wrike Discover by the end of this week. Now, in today's part 2 session, we'll talk about effort and story points management, Kanban board style management, Scrum and Sprint configuration, and hybrid Agile fall. We're aiming for about 40 minutes for today's session. I know that there were some teasers from Brett last time, so hope you're eager to learn more. And one more thing, please use the Q&A section in Zoom to submit your questions during the session. With that, Brett, it's over to you. Please tell a little bit about yourself, especially for those who joined today for the first time.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brett. I think I see some names from last time, but also some new names. So just catching you all up to speed quickly, and then we'll jump into the stuff, the topics from today. So my name is Brett. I've been a professional service consultant here at Wrike for a little over 6 years, worked with teams small and large, all sorts of use cases, marketing, IT, etc. Have some history in the past working on a Scrum team for about 6-7 years ago, but still remember most of it, hopefully, and use that information with a lot of my clients and how to roll out Agile at Wrike. So going to be jumping into this momentarily and sharing my screen. If you do have questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A section within your Zoom browser, and we will get to those momentarily. I do love questions along the way. It helps make sure that I'm kind of not losing you as we go through this. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and jump right into it. Alex or Maria, can you, wait, actually, I don't think it went through. There we go. Can you confirm you can see my screen showing sprint developments?
Yes.
Sprint development at the top? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so again, real quick, catching everybody up. We are going to be going through some examples of what Scrum and sprints can look like and how to structure them, a few variations today. If you're interested in seeing this material, getting a copy of this, if you haven't already, you do have access to this through the Create button in the top right, and hitting space. And when you are creating a space, assuming you are an admin in your space, if you're not seeing this, you're probably not an account level admin, in which case you might need help from one of your admins. But we are looking for the space template called knowledge base. And if you go ahead and hit the preview button and select, that will create a copy. And you can find this within there in section 7. I guess I'll show that real quick. Right in your knowledge base, once it's fully created, you'll see a number of things, and what I'm looking for is sample blueprints and number 7 specifically, and that's going to have a few examples here, including the development section. So feel free to use that space template, create this, and you'll find about a 95% similar version. There's a few changes I've made just over time using this example, but mostly the same. All right. Give me one moment. Okay, so last time we talked a little bit, again, just catching everybody up on the structure here without going too much into it. We generally speaking are creating our epics, which is where we are storing all of the tasks and items and stories and sagas, etc., that we need to build for some feature, product, campaign, etc. And then we have those items cross-tagged, meaning they are tagged into 2 locations, into our either backlog initially and or eventually moving into specific sprints. And backlog usually means this is our storing spot, and we move our items into sprint 4 when we're getting ready for it, and then move sprint 4 into current sprint after sprint 3 has moved down into completed sprints. So we're going to talk a little bit about today about kind of like how we make those moves and what we are changing, some things to consider, some custom fields that are going to be useful, how we do prioritization a little bit, some examples there, how we do resourcing, again, some few examples there. We'll talk then a little bit about what I've seen more and more in my time here, which is a more hybrid agile approach, which is a more mixture of more true waterfall as far as like phase development and or linear development or linear creation of work items with a agile approach kind of mixed into things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk through some examples of some Kanban boards and how you might use them if you're doing more Kanban style approach, with some kind of tips and tricks of using our board view to kind of facilitate what you're looking for. All right, I think that kind of covers the agenda. Oh, one other thing is automations. We'll talk about some useful automations that can help make you a little bit more efficient with some of the moving of pieces, with some of the assignments, stuff along those lines. So picking back up first with our initial development and initial Scrum style or sprint style approach here. Wanted to talk through a few items of kind of how we operate in our backlog and a little bit more detail into some of these custom fields. Now, I've seen, like I said on the last call, the term agile intentionally is supposed to be flexible. And so there's differences every single team. So lots of teams do things differently, just to kind of show how we have some options here. And then I'll talk through kind of my preference. I've seen teams use a drop down. Is this priority 1, 2, or 3, or 0, 1, 2, or 3, F, A, B, C, D, F, etc. I've seen things like story points with a drop down, and some teams use Fibonacci codes, some teams use a more true work breakdown structure within their custom fields. Some teams are using just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., like we're using here in the numerical priority version. Wrike is built, just taking a step back really quick, outside of Agile. The preference that Wrike has when it comes to resource management is to use the effort field, and just kind of calling out what that means outside of our sprints. If a task has 2 weeks of duration, and that's obviously another field, although we're not usually using date sort fields inside of Agile use cases. But if we have 10 days to work on this feature, that doesn't necessarily mean we're working on it for 8 hours a day for those 10 days. We could have 80 hours of work associated with this, but more often than not, it's something that we expect, okay, I'm going to work on this through 2-3 hours a day, and I have 3 or 4 or 5 tasks assigned to me every day so that I have multiple things I'm working on, whether that's because we know that there's going to be a delay. I need to send off an email and wait for an answer. I don't want to just sit at my desk waiting for the answer. I can go work on something else. Or whether it's because, there's machine time that we need for rendering, whether there's, 6 different things going on, and it's just, I'm juggling all 6 of them. And so it's, realistic to have, only an hour and a half, 2 hours a day, whatever the reason might be. We have effort separated from duration. When it comes to doing our resource management in our workload charts, that's generally speaking, we build that off of effort. So just going into my preference, I would say is for teams to be using the effort column. Now, I know a lot of Scrum teams, a lot of Agile teams come from story points, and that's totally fine. We do have some options for building analytics boards that can kind of help there, but our workload charts, which is where we do more of our true resource management and capacity planning, assuming you have workload charts with your license, is that we are using effort in those. And so typically I prefer to use effort as my way of kind of prioritization, not prioritization, of capacity and resource planning. So that, yes, we could still have priority here, whether it's in the priority there or my priority numerical value. We could do story points separately as more of the effort or we use the effort fields. And then I'm often using some sort of calculation here to do a weighted value, if you will. Maybe I should call this weight value. But what I've done in this case is simply taken my numerical value, our numerical priority, and this is just a 1 through 5. And again, or sorry, this is actually a blank level text entry and for numbers, I should say, and you can see it automatically updates the calculation here. This is saying this is, in my case, I use the higher numbers like 8 as a lower priority. I inverted it just because I like to see smaller numbers, but you could do the opposite if you prefer to see bigger numbers. But this is saying, I have a numerical value of 8 and a total effort of 30, and that comes out to 30 hours a day. Now here, 20 hours times the 1, it ends up with, that's 20 hours of work here, which is 2.5 days, right? 20 hours total. So I use this as a way of getting a weighted value in order to determine what should go into my sprint, right? If you think about it this way, the higher the priority means the lower the number here, and the lower the effort means the less work it should take to do. So your easiest grabs, your most value is from doing your high priority, low effort type work. And that's what I'm trying to see here in my weighted value, helps me kind of prioritize. Now, that said, there are a ton of other different versions of how you need to prioritize, right? You can't always do it off of effort. So priority sometimes takes the preference. Sometimes we have to go off of that. Sometimes we go off of, other numbers that we are using. T-shirt sizing can be another way of doing weight, by the way, or doing effort, by the way. You have a custom field with small, medium, large, something along those lines. I've seen teams just use our priority feature here, which is when we sort by priority, we can actually drag and drop things around. If feature 26 is actually going to get deprioritized, we can grab this in our table view by hovering over the little 8 dots on the left and dragging it down, and make sure that they're just calling out, if you're not aware, there's a difference between dragging it into an item like I'm showing here in feature 11 and between items. So just be really careful with your mouse as you're showing this, because this is two different things. This makes it a subtask inside of feature 11, like when I drop it there, versus when I move it between, say, thing 1 and thing 2, it now makes it just in a different location on my priority list. So using priority sorting, using custom fields, there's a number of ways of doing it, and they all kind of work for this regard. Now I see a couple of questions in chat. Let me just make sure we go through them and see if there's anything pressing.
Yes, Brett, the questions are about having templates enabled in the account. So both questions are about that.
You might be able to create a space as a regular user, as a regular license, but you need to be an admin license in order to use the space templates. So you might need to ask somebody who is an account level admin. If you're a space level admin, that's not going to do it here. We need to be an account level admin to get access to that feature. It's possible that there are different account levels that don't have access to it. I don't recall offhand, but generally speaking, we can follow up with you and let you know on that information. I don't know, Jillian, offhand. There is one of my customers has turned that space templates functionality off. I've never heard of another customer doing that, but we'll have to maybe follow up. Alex and Maria, can we follow up with those users and or those people and see what's going on?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. All right, getting back into things. So again, how we're doing this priority. Now, once I have things, my personal preference, not everybody does this, is I create my sprint 4 or my upcoming sprint inside of my backlog, as you can see it here, with the reason being it makes it a lot easier. Okay, I'm looking through my weight. I see the lowest weight we actually have scores for is right here, thing 8. And I can just grab it and move thing 8 inside of sprint 4. And in this case, I can either move it into sprint 4 or between those other tasks living within it. Either one would work. So I've moved thing 8 up into my sprint 4. I'm doing this kind of as a Scrum Master, let's say, prior to my sprint planning meeting. If I know, or I'm able to kind of calculate, what we should be working on next, whether I'm working in partnership with my product owner, or my campaign lead, or I'm the person who makes those decisions, etc. We are moving those up into sprint 4. That way, when we're done with sprint 3, we finish our sprint review, we finish our sprint retrospectives, we move sprint 3 into our completed sprints. I'll talk a little bit about some of the notations here. And we can move sprint 4, which is ready to go, into our current sprint. That way, when it comes to our sprint planning meeting, we can hide all the clutter. We don't need to see necessarily the backlog offhand. We usually go through this. We assign out all of our tasks to our different people, right? Han, you get this one. Okay, we're talking through who can take this task on. Leia gets this one. She has bandwidth for it. Maybe we give a couple of tasks to Leia here, etc. And if we need to, we can still say, okay, you know what? Luke Skywalker's still got some bandwidth. Let's go back and look at the backlog together, find one or two more things, and we can change that here in the location field. So if we know that we're going to be moving it to sprint 4, I like to right-click on sprint 4, copy the link, so I just have it. It's easier than finding it, typing it in, and I click directly in there, and I will add that hyperlink and click on adding it to sprint 4, and then just simply remove it from our backlog here. Now this thing 5 is going to disappear from my backlog, and it will move into my sprint 4, and I know it's the correct sprint 4 here, or sprint whatever it might be, because I right-clicked and copied the link there.
Brett, we've got one more great question about sorting. Is it possible to sort by multiple fields, like first by priority, then by status?
Today, not in our table view. However, I believe, yes, in the very near future. We have within our own Wrike account, we obviously alpha test things. And we do have a feature like this that we are in testing right now to group or sort, technically called group by multiple fields. I can't 100% promise because I haven't played around enough with the alpha, and also alphas are obviously alphas intentionally. We might make changes to things. But my understanding is I believe sometime this quarter, if not sooner, then we will be having a feature like that in table views, allowing you to group. We do have that ability today inside of our reports. If you go and you were to build one of our tools and build a report, there is a group by feature right now, and you could group by status and then by a custom field called priority. The one thing you can't do, and I don't think you'll be able to do in the new version either, to your question, is I don't think I'll be able to sort by priority and then also sort by some of these field values inside of like the priority sorting is different than a custom field or a field value here. So you could sort by multiple, like priority and effort, but I don't believe by this priority and another field. But again, subject to change. It's in early alphas, so I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
Good question, though. Thank you. And more to come on that one, in all honesty. We'll probably hear feedback like that and make some improvements as we typically try to do. Okay, so we've moved our items into sprint 4. We have assigned things out. We've started working through these items. We eventually get them all, as many as we can completed, and we move those sprints down into the completed section after our sprint review and sprint planning, or retrospective, sorry. Now, I wanted to talk a few things I've kind of learned over the years, how different teams operate when it comes to the completion of a sprint. And we talked about this a little bit on our last one, but it was a little confusing to me, and there's a lot of options and pros and cons. So I wanted to kind of talk through this again a little bit. When I'm operating inside my sprint, and let's say I've completed a number of our tasks, we've gone through our sprint planning and our sprint review. Actually, let me just use one that I already have done, and we've marked these items completed, but there's still a few items left that are still not marked completed. And for example, you can see this feature 8. We have a few options, right? We still need to get feature 8 done. We just didn't finish it inside of sprint 3 the way we were hoping. Now, a few things I've seen that are kind of worth mentioning is we can take feature 8 right here, and we could just move it to the next sprint, right? Sprint 4. Sometimes it doesn't go straight to sprint 4. Sometimes it goes back to the backlog, and then it waits until we're ready to take it on again, and then we bring it into sprint 7, maybe down the road. As soon as you move it from this sprint, we lose historical reference that it was part of sprint 3. And so you can see it in the auditing history that if you look at it individually and see that, oh, this used to be, it was moved from sprint 3 to backlog and then moved from backlog to sprint 7. But I like to see it just visibly here. And so I like to add to instead of moving to. And that will allow you to add it to also sprint 4 right here. And now it lives in both this sprint 3 and sprint 4. And in this case, I had it in sprint 2 as well. It also lives in Epic. We talked a bit about that on our last session. So this is a way of seeing all of the work that needs to get done as part of Epic 3 while still being able to see it lives in sprint 3. But I'd like to see the add to for my historical reference point. The problem with this is that when I do mark this task completed in sprint 4, now sprint 3 is going to look like it was 100% completed. And we sometimes need that for review down the road. A lot of Agile teams like to be able to review and see, did we complete that sprint successfully? Was it a failure? What percent did we complete? For historical reference, which sprint teams are operating better, which teams need help, et cetera, et cetera. For whatever reasons it might be, the historical reference can be pretty useful. Now, I've seen that done a number of ways. I've seen it, if we just need it as a quick glance, I need to see, was it a failure or was it a success? I often see emojis used like this, copied and pasted from sprint to sprint, where you can just see very visibly, very quickly that we have a red X. It was not a completion. Now, what your completion percentage needs to be is up to you. I typically find something around 60 to 75%, about like 75% usually is what I see, 70, 75. Now I've seen it done where we just add the X yes or no here, but I've also seen us adding a percentage down in a custom field. Now, just calling out in case you're not aware, Wrike does not allow filtering off of titles. So if you said, show me every sprint where we had a red X, couldn't do it. If you said, show me a count, how many had a red X versus a yellow thumbs up, couldn't do it. But we can run reports and filters off of custom fields. And this is where we often are using the percent completion here. And you might still want to have it visibly added. So it's not uncommon to also see it 75% up here, but we usually want to add it to a custom field value if you plan on reviewing and making any sort of, introspective, retrospective from the information within the sprints. Sort of off of that note, I have seen other versions to still kind of, again, identify tasks that were completed in the correct sprint versus a later sprint. So for example, I've seen, feature 8 here. Let's say, yes, we later on in sprint 4 eventually mark it complete, but there's no way of telling now when you're just purely looking at feature 8, there's no way of telling, did I mark this complete in the original sprint it was intended on, or was it completed late? Now, I've seen a number of ways of doing this. I've seen teams have different statuses, and I don't know if I have any examples in here, but yeah, there you go. Whoops. Let's go back one more time. I've seen teams have a completed and a completed failed, or a completed but completed late type different statuses. That way they can filter and say, show me which one it was at a quick glance, or how many were completed late, things along those lines. I've also seen a really interesting use case once or twice that I've always wanted to dive into more, where we have just a custom field value, and I think it was a drop down of a 0 or a 1. And we use, if it was completed on time, then we mark it as 0 and we don't worry about it. If it was marked late, we add a 1. If it was marked 2 sprints late, we add a 2, and so on and so forth, to give kind of a weighted value to how late it was, essentially, or how much longer it took than we were planning on. And then I've seen that used in conjunction with, again, numeric, like formula fields to calculate values and weights of, how much things were late, or how much of a pain it was, so that we kind of learn what to do and what not to do next time. Seeing all sorts of, I saw kind of a lot of interesting analytics off of those numbers. I've only seen it once or twice, but I've always found it interesting and thought worth mentioning in this case. So lots of different options here. I think that was maybe what the sprint cycle was it completed on time? It was a 0, otherwise a 1 or a 2 or a 3, something along those lines. It's been a little bit, but I've always found that kind of interesting and worth mentioning. All right, now there are dozens of other custom fields we could dive into. Just again, I like to talk about this a little bit more holistically, in that if you need to filter data in Wrike, there are really only 2 ways to break it down to filter data. There is by location and there is by fields. So if I ever need to see, how many of my sprints were completed. I can see that there are 3 projects inside this location, and the system knows that and can interpret as such. If I need to see how many of my items were not started or were completed, I can also use the status fields here, or custom fields as we add them. So really, when it comes down to it, I'd like to kind of more macro level solve this or answer this question is, if there's anything you want to filter by, and by filter, that could mean reports, that could be dashboards, that could be see on a calendar, only specific events or something along those. If there's any time we need to call out specific tasks or projects in the system, we need to have a custom field that allows us to call out and focus on whichever items you're looking for. And or we can use a folder location. In the case of Agile teams, it's much more often going to be the custom fields here, because we are using the folders more as our workflow for items to move through. I'm going to pause there. Alex, Maria, was there any questions in chat while I have a quick sip of water?
We don't have any at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think this is hopefully good for the basic versions, if you will. Again, there's tons, I mentioned this in the last call, there's tons of variation here. I've seen teams do separate backlogs for bugs versus development. I've seen teams add risk folders where whenever a task is at risk, some teams just use like a status, but other teams like to add it to the risk folder. And sometimes we also have a request form for creating, for submitting risks and issues and change requests and things along those lines. And so sometimes we have folders for those. Tons of variation in how you structure this, but the basic concept still comes down to, I like to have a permanent folder for backlog, current, and completed. That way we can move our sprints through those folders without having to re-edit our reports and our dashboards and filters every time to look at the specific sprint. Instead, we just focus on the current sprint folder, but lots of variation there. Now, I mentioned a few times I want to get to hybrid here. This I'm seeing more and more over the last few years. And this is where we have essentially like an actual Gantt chart and more linear project management, more traditional project management, saying that, we need to work on, and I don't know what happened to all my tasks here. Sorry, maybe I grabbed the wrong one or something happened, but usually we have tasks inside our initiate that lead into define requirements, that lead into develop solutions. And so we have kind of a linear approach. And picking back up here, maybe I just have all of my work completed or something. There we go. You can see it now. I just had a filter turned on. So let's change this. So we have, our work here that leads in, and a lot of this is done not necessarily by my Agile teams, right? But if you're thinking on like a campaign, a marketing campaign, for example, we need to determine, okay, what is the strategy we are going to be going with this for this campaign? What's our goals? What's our objectives? How are we accomplishing that? Maybe then we define our requirements and we have some reviews, go, no goes, etc. And eventually we get to the part where we are developing. Now in software development, usually handled as epics with features and user stories and things along those lines, but applies still to, say, your marketing team where, okay, now we need to build out the blog material. We need to build out the video material. We need to build the social material, the digital material, et cetera, et cetera. And so we often are kind of breaking those down into different developments within kind of our linear plan. And so we do those different developments. It might take, in this case, 1, 2, 3 sprints to get everything done, breaking those up into 2-week chunks. And then eventually we kind of come back together into that more linear approach where we're validating, deploying, analysis, et cetera. So this is a more linear approach that has a broken down section of the development section. And that development is still handled through epics. So again, think of the epics here as maybe the digital material, the social material, the event planning, the et cetera, et cetera. And then within that structure, we have those epics. Well, those epics can also be cross-tagged as they are here into this O2 development section. That way, my development team, let's say it's my creative team in the case of a marketing org, or again, if it's my software development team, my devs, my QA, my product managers, et cetera, we have those epics cross-tagged living in both the overall schedule here, the overall project plan that might be taking a year long, let's say, but then we can still have our individual epics where we're kind of planning on only the development taking, let's say, obviously it's going to be more than 3 sprints, but you get the idea. And so this allows us to have those epics up here as part of the overall schedule, because they don't care, right? Well, they care, but my PMO, my campaign managers, my overall kind of maybe my product owners, they're not as focused on the day-to-day of what feature are you working on any given specific sprint. They just care about the epics and all getting done, which means all of the stuff inside of it. And they'll let you handle that in the development section here. So these are 2 folders that are kind of conjoined, if you will, here, with the more linear approach showing everything, but they don't care about the sprints in this section. We just care about the epics. Then those epics tagged into this 00 folder here, in my case, within our sprint section. That could even be a separate space, by the way. I try not to make it that, but it can be sometimes. I find it more often than I'd probably like. And then within here, we now as the development team can also cross tag all of the tasks into my backlog, and then from there work through them in the sprints as we go through. It's not the only way of doing even this version. As I said, I said this once, I'll say it a million times. There's no right or wrong way to do things in Wrike, to configure things in Wrike. We're much more art than science, I would say, but especially in the Agile use cases, which have so much variation. But again, generally speaking, this is our structure here. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep jumping straight on into Kanban. But again, please, we'll work through after this call and get anybody access to those space templates if you don't have them. Sincere apologies if there's something else I'm missing that why I'm just not thinking of it offhand. All right, jumping into Kanban. This is a bit different. There are also like Scrumban, which is going to be a little bit more hybrid again, but I'm just going to focus on kind of a more basic Kanban. And for, again, anybody on the call who's not super familiar, this is kind of the original way I would say of Agile, which is let's get a whiteboard together. Back in the day when we were in office, let's get some sticky notes, and we would have columns essentially, right? We would have column A is not started, column B is in progress, column C is in testing, column D is ready for launch, and so on. And we would just go to the board and move our items along every single day to kind of show where things were. Now, in that approach, I'm going to start by showing us office openings. I have just a couple of examples here. This was originally for like an IT team as an example, saying let's show what it would look like for our IT team to kind of put a new location together, a new facility together. And the idea here is we have those columns here in our board view as the statuses. So this is Kanban boards in Wrike are always tied to a status. And if it depends on whatever is the default workflow right here of that location. So I'm clicked into this project, right click, change workflow, and whatever workflow I have selected here, that's what's going to show up. The status is at the top, just FYI. Now within those items, and sorry, I meant to turn these off initially, and I'm going to talk about those in a second, but we just have, here is the list of things we need to get done, right? And they are, here's not started, here's the in progress, in review, etc. And we simply drag and drop these things along as we're working on them. I'm finished the firewall section, I move it, or I'm working on it, I move it to in progress, eventually to review, approved, etc., whatever these statuses might be, and eventually over into our completed assets delivered, let's say. Now, within this, we also allow you to move up and down. So if right now these are the 4 in progress and firewalls is a little higher priority, let's just move it up. We do store this as long as, again, we are sorting by priority here. Now, this is pretty simple enough. A couple of things that are worth adding to it is cards. This is where you can turn on more information or turn off information within each of these tasks, or cards as we're calling them here. And a couple that are really worth useful in my mind is if you are doing attachments for things. And again, this came from an IT example, a little bit more straightforward. But you can see here, if I turn on cover image, it does show any attachments stored within the assets. I found this with like an engineering teams can be really useful. You add your image to anything and it just makes it easier to know what these are. But if you don't like that, if it's cluttering up your boards too much, you have 1,000 items on here and now you can only see 20 of them, just turn off or turn on the cover image in the card section. Second one is location, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But otherwise, let's look through, it's the same old, same old. We have statuses. We can turn, well, we don't turn statuses on because they're on the columns, but we could do by assignee or by author. We could do by custom field values, etc. There's a newer feature as well. This is relatively new, which is to allow grouping by assignee here. And this is where how we can do swim lanes. Now, in my case, I don't really have this information stored, but if I was to, let's say, add, again, Han Solo here, and maybe we'll add him here as well. We'll add, and you can see now that we have our unassigned bucket, but we also can do swim lanes for Han Solo down here and all of his tasks by status and so on. So this allows us to do, again, more traditional Kanban, like whiteboarding, if you will, where we can look at this during a stand-up meeting. Back in the day, we would have a TV in the section of our office where my team would work, and we would have our stand-up, our Kanban board on our monitor to kind of go through this digitally. I mentioned earlier the card for location. I want to jump in and talk about that really quick. I find teams, even though you could use custom fields to trigger information like priority and on schedule or not, in the cards here, you can use custom fields. Back in the day, we didn't used to be able to do that, and I found this alternative of having subfolders here that we could work off of and tag things into, so we could cross tag things into these other folders. I still kind of like this approach because it allows you to use the color coding of each of those folders. And it just becomes much more apparent right here in our boards that you can see not only is this in progress, but it's priority 1 and it's currently on schedule, for example. Now, those could be any names you want, any types. They could be any sorts of filtering that you'd like to. But this is a task now that lives in those 3 items, in the priority 1 folder, in the on schedule folder, and also in this Ocean View Drive folder. You could click into it the other way. If I wanted to see this internet task, I could also click into the priority folder here, and there's that internet. So this allows you to also look at things also in a board view. Here's my priority 1 stuff only, whether it's from Ocean View Drive or from Bayview Drive here. And it still would also bring in those other items. So let me turn that on real quick. Whoops, there we go. And so again, as long as location is on, you can see which project it came from now, the other statuses or status column folders here, and so on and so forth. Lots of other cards, card info you can turn on or off again. Sometimes custom field values can be like really helpful there. Sometimes you don't need some of our information, so turn them on or off. But the idea here is this is less about grouping work with a specific epic and more just this is everything we need to do. So you could almost think of these as maybe the epics themselves, right? In this case, this is location is the epic in this situation or use case, I suppose. But I want to pause there, make sure if we're missing anything, or Alex, if there's any questions from the team. I did want to briefly mention automations, but that'll be the last topic.
I also have a question about the project progress. You mentioned that sprints are often associated with the completion percentage.
Yes.
So do teams use the native project progress feature for that?
Typically not. So just to cover what we're talking about here, within any project, oh gosh, we moved where this is now, sorry. There is let me find it. There is a progress, sorry. I can't think and talk at the same time. There is the ability to turn on project progress, and this allows us to calculate right here the percent completed of, say, sprint 4. Now, this is a little kind of automated in the sense that it's built a certain way. What it does by default is just count your tasks. There's 8 tasks in here. You've completed 2 of them. 2 divided by 8 is 25%, and it gives you that number here. In more linear projects, I see this used heavily, but in Agile or sprint projects, I don't see it used. With the reason being is that often because we are working on these things for 2-week chunks, I'm often not finishing these items until the end of my 2 weeks. And so we often see something where day 9 out of our 2-week sprint, we still have 0% completed because we're still working on all 8 of these things. And then come day 10, all of a sudden we jump to 100%. So I don't see that used very heavily. What I do see as an alternative is a custom field for something along those lines, where we might say something like percent completed. And as I'm working through this, I might say I'm at 50%, and this one's at 25%, and this one's at 10%, and this one's at 80%. And we can do some aggregations there. Now, in this case, I would need to do it as a aggregation of an average here. I don't love even that one per se, because it doesn't account for weight, right? This is saying 50% of a task that might be 1 hour versus 80% of a task that might be 10 hours, right? Those are two very different weights. If that's something you're interested in, it's probably recommended to do a couple of custom fields. You're going to need to have a weight custom field. You're going to need to have a percent custom field, and then do another one that's a formula field that does some sort of calculation. That one, I don't think we're going to have time to get into today, and it's a little bit more complex. Not a ton of my teams do something like that, but I have seen teams do weighted completion percentage, if you will, and then have that number sum up. And it's usually done all the way to the top level, where essentially we have like a numerator sum and a denominator sum that add up, and then we run a formula field across those two at the top level to get your true percentage completed. If anybody's interested in that, I suppose we could follow up as well offline. Or that would be a good thing to bring out to your customer success manager or account manager as well, and they can introduce you to somebody from professional services for that. Just last thing real quick is to remember that we also have automation rules now available in every single space. We're not going to have time to get to every example I've seen. In fact, I don't think that would take days, but the general idea is to remember we have some sort of triggers, conditions of when those triggers should operate, and then the actions of what should be done. And with sprint teams, probably the most common I see is changing of statuses. Change item status here to, after a certain time frame, like after when a date is approaching or overdue, the end of the sprint, for example, change item status to completed or canceled or something. I don't see that a ton because I prefer to do that in the review and retrospective. So I find that we do a lot more manual changing of statuses, but I do see it from time to time. Probably a more common one is the movement of location. So this is when a project is marked completed, let's say, when a status changes to completed, like when the sprint is marked completed, change and move that item into, wrong action, but move that action item into the location of our completed sprint folder, something along those lines. So this is one that I like to kind of, again, handle more generically. Just remember, there is a trigger of when something happens. There is the condition of what situations should this occur for, and the action of what are we doing then. And again, usually, and especially with Scrum teams, it at most is changing location, maybe adding comments to somebody like, hey, the sprint is almost at an end. Please review and update all of your information. Could be a daily action that says every day and is a trigger, then add comment or at mention saying, please update your sprint items, something along those lines. So notifications is a really big action I would see use cases for here, but obviously there's more than that. And I think with that, I will pause. We are at time. I'm going to hand back over to Alex. Thank you all so much for sticking with me through this.
Thank you, Brett. Please submit your questions. Now is a good time to answer the final questions. Meanwhile, I'm going to share my screen with information about professional services. And by the way, thank you so very much, Brett, for sharing your insights. I personally love the automation feature, and they keep adding more and more triggers, more and more actions that really save us a lot of time. So thank you everyone for participation today. But after this session, if you feel like there are not enough resources for implementing an agile workflow and structure, our professional services team is always ready to assist and simplify the process for you. Should you have enjoyed these sessions, and we sincerely hope you did, you'll find the immense value in Wrike professional services that cater to businesses of all scales by offering expert advice and support. Our professional services team provides tailored training and onboarding sessions that enable teams to fully understand and set up the platform to the unique requirements. Brett, is there anything else we could add to this slide?
No, just again, there's lots of use cases, teams that need help with services, both new teams getting onboarded, old teams starting out with Agile, teams that have been using Agile or any use case for a while and just want somebody to kind of come through and help improve efficiencies there. We meet with teams that are brand new to teams that have been with us for 6-7 years. And sometimes it's just a little second pair of eyes because you don't know what you don't know. And we're here to kind of help you with the guidance that makes the most sense with you. So if you're interested in that at all, talk to your account manager and they can get you to meet with somebody from our services team to kind of review your situation, your use cases, and what, if anything, makes sense for us to help you with.
Thank you so much, Brett. Thank you, Alex, as well, for your support. And thank you, everyone. It was great having you here. I hope this training has enhanced your knowledge of different Agile styles. And we would appreciate your feedback on the sessions.